Hello, good evening. If you can see me, if you're there, make yourself known. If you can't see me, well, I'm just talking to myself in a car park, which wouldn't be the first time, would it? Make yourself known. Is there anybody there? I'm reaching out to the living. There is somebody there. I can feel a presence. I can see things on the screen as well, which helps, of course. Say hi or give me a thumbs up. Yes, you can hear me, I take it. Good. I'll just wait for maybe one or two more people before I start. Oh, look. They've lit the tree up. Just for me. Well, for you. So that's good, isn't it? Bit more about that maybe in a bit. Hello there. Hello, Stacey. Hello, Karen. Very good. Well, this building you see behind me, if you can see it anyway, is York's Crown Court. Still in use, and that's why I'm down here as opposed to being up there, because I think the security might object if I was standing up there. Anyway, so yes, that's York's Crown Court. It's been in use since the 1800s, and the cells are still waiting for any naughty people who happen to be coming to York. So I'm going to move over here just in case. Now, the building you see in front of me is York's Castle Museum. But for most of its life, it was York's prisons. And this site has been a place of incarceration for many centuries, going all the way back to the Normans, in fact. William the Conqueror built the first castle in York back in 1068. And we know from records that it had dungeons, of course, like many castles do. But this magnificent building and the magnificent buildings you see around only go back to the 18th century. But nevertheless, many poor souls and not so poor souls were incarcerated in these cells, in these buildings. There was a debtor's prison, because back in the day, if you got into a bit of financial difficulty, you couldn't just go and do a balance transfer or go to quickquid.com. Basically, you went straight to jail. Don't pass go. Don't collect £200. £200 would, of course, be very handy if you were in debt, but sadly not the case. And you were sent to jail, and you stayed there till the debts were repaid, which is hard to do if you're in jail. Also, sometimes you had to take your children in there with you. They also had condemned man's cells in this area of the prison where people spent their last nights before being taken away to be executed. And execution is going to be one of the themes of tonight's video. It's going to be a bit different to the last video. I don't like to repeat everything. So basically this is going to be more about bloody executions and dark history than ghosts. However, this is York, the most haunted city in Europe, and there will be, of course, one or two ghosts tonight. So keep your eyes peeled, you never know what we might see whilst we're walking around. Now, many people, of course, visit the museum when it's open in the pre-COVID days, and many people have reported strange sounds and other experiences, staff working there, visitors, and so much so that, of course, various professional ghost hunters and mediums have come down to investigate. They say they've heard footsteps walking around when the place is empty, the sounds of chains being dragged along, voices even a woman singing, and things have shown up in photographs quite often. There've been figures, a little girl's been seen repeatedly, of course, inside there. Many photos of her have been around, and orbs as well, glowing balls of light, which are often a spiritual manifestation. So it's not surprising, given the number of people incarcerated here, that something has remained behind. But I'm going to talk about a particular prisoner, quite a well-known one, certainly in Yorkshire anyway. Her name was Mary Bateman. The name might not ring a bell to some of you, but she was also known as the Yorkshire Witch. Now, how did she come by such a title? Well, back in the 1800s, she lived in Leeds, not far from here, and she was well known as a fortune teller and a healer, somebody you'd go to if you needed a bit of help. Not many people could afford a doctor, no national health service, and she'd help sort out little problems, give advice and so on. But she was a more dodgy character than you might expect, had been for most of her life. Even since she was a child, she'd been in trouble for stealing and lying, and she'd been involved in all sorts of scams to try and make money. When there was a fire in Leeds, she went around collecting money and supplies for the poor people who'd lost their homes and belongings. They never saw any of it. Straight into her pockets. So she was a bit of a dubious character, and she moved around a lot. But she hit upon a scam. There were quite a lot of people willing to believe in the supernatural, even in the 1800s when things were a bit more educated. And so she came up with all these scams. She basically helped people, but more helped herself. She had one particular scam where she claimed the end of the world was coming, and as proof, believe it or not, she produced a hen that laid eggs with messages saying, "Christ is coming." How she achieved this, it turned out, was rather unpleasant, especially for the chicken. She etched the words with acid onto the egg and then reinserted it back up inside the chicken, which, you don't have to be a chicken to imagine is pretty painful. And then, lo and behold, people would pay a penny a time to see this chicken produce these magic eggs. Well, there you go. Bit of a money spinner. And then she sold the chicken, I think, as well. But what really got her into trouble was a couple called the Perigos, William and Rebecca. Rebecca Perigo was suffering very badly. She had chest pains. A doctor couldn't help her, but they had a bit of money, and so they went to see this woman, this fabled healer and prophet. Mary Bateman spotted a couple of easy marks a mile away, and of course she would help them for some money, of course. And so they gave her quite a bit of money, quite a few shillings, which was a lot for them back in the day, to make magic charms which would help, of course, ward off this evil spell that she said was on them. But of course it didn't really help. So she said, well, of course I need some more help. So she called on a friend of hers, Mrs. Bryce, a powerful medium living in Scarborough, who didn't actually exist. But she would of course need more money to help this healing process. So more money, of course, was brought forward by the Perigos. Sadly, hadn't cottoned on to the fact they were being conned. But of course, poor Rebecca, she started to get worse. "Ah, well, I've got a solution to that," said Mary. "There's a special pudding I'm going to make for you. You must both eat it. You must both eat it every night. Have a bit of this pudding." You see, what had actually been happening is she was putting arsenic in their food, and to finish off the job, she'd put a bit more in this pudding, just to get rid of them, of course, before they started to get wise. So they started to eat it, but her husband, he couldn't manage to eat it. It tasted too foul, too bitter. Rebecca, though, sadly ate the lot. Doubled over with cramps and pain, vomiting, she collapsed and died. And her husband finally decided that it was up to Mary. He blamed her. He checked these magical amulets and charms. There was just nothing inside there, just paper. He realised he'd been duped, and he went straight to the constable, and Mary was arrested and brought to the courts behind me over there, where she was put on trial in 1809 before being sentenced to death at the New Drop Gallows just across the way from here. But nevertheless, people still believed that she might possess supernatural powers, and so thousands of people turned up to see her execution, in case she disappeared in a puff of smoke or summoned a demon or some creature to save her from the gallows. It didn't happen, just in case you hadn't gathered. And she dropped and died. But that is not the end of the story. You might think, of course, it's a pretty final end, but not quite for Mary. You see, back in the 18th century, a lot of murderers and serious criminals were also sentenced to be dissected. It was believed still by many that you couldn't get into heaven unless your body was complete, or mostly complete. And so this was an extra terror for those convicted, that basically their bodies would be dissected. They can never find eternal rest. And this happened to Mary. She was sent to Leeds Hospital, where in fact her skeleton still is. It was on display at the Factory Medical Museum for many, many years, till eventually it was deemed to be unsuitable to be put on display anymore. However, some of her also survives elsewhere. They sold strips of her skin as souvenirs, believe it or not. Strips of her tanned skin, and they made about 30 quid. So there we go. She was worth a bit, even after her death. Now this door here, this white door you might see, this was the exit, the final exit for many, from the women's prison here. This was where they took them out to the New Drop Gallows, erected in 1802. And this is where Mary would have come out to be executed. But she lives on in posthumous fame anyway. So not perhaps a witch, but certainly an interesting character. But she's far from the only person, of course, executed here in York. We used to have more executions in York than almost anywhere apart from London. Now I'm just going to take a quick look at Clifford's Tower up there. It's nicely illuminated. It's almost all that remains of York's castle. It's undergoing a bit of a facelift at the moment. A bit of work going on there to open up a new visitor attraction. But here, many other people have met their end in various unpleasant and nasty ways, which is kind of what you're here to hear about, isn't it? So I'm just going to get on the pavement before I get hit by a car and meet my own unpleasant end, really. So Clifford's Tower, this isn't the original one. Get a bit more light on me. Clifford's Tower, this one here, built in stone around the 1200s. The original tower was built of wood back in the days of William the Conqueror. And many people died here in 1190 when we had one of the most terrible events in York's long history. We were fighting the Crusades in the Middle East, led by Richard I, Richard Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, that great English king who was French and didn't really speak a word of English, to be honest. He didn't spend much time here. He did not like it very much. It was cold, it was wet. He would prefer to be elsewhere. So off he went. Incidentally, he was played by Sean Connery with a Scottish accent. Better than that one. And there you go. One of the oddities of history. But Richard was off fighting in the Middle East. And this, of course, required a great deal of money to finance his campaigns. Now, the church had forbade people to lend money, but the Jews could lend money and did quite a bit, and so he borrowed a lot of money from the Jews, in return for which he promised them royal protection. But he was away, he was miles away fighting, so he wasn't really around. And sadly, as today, there's still a lot of prejudice. It's a fact of human nature. We do have these beliefs, and there's people who were very much against the Jews for various reasons, partly of course because a lot of them owed the Jews money. And so an anti-Semitic riot broke out here in the city of York in March 1190. People were chased through the streets, attacked, houses burnt down, people fearing for their lives, and so they came here to the old wooden castle on the hill seeking refuge, and they were allowed inside. But but they were surrounded by a mob demanding that they come outside and face justice of a sort. They would be allowed to live if they converted to Christianity, and of course that would cancel out any debts that the people had, or they would die. It wasn't much of a choice, to be fair to the people of York, to give them. They stayed in there for a few days, but eventually the mob were restless. Fearing for their lives, they could do nothing else, but the tower was set on fire with them inside, and that forced their hand. They could either go outside and face the mob, see if they survived. They could stay inside and burn. Many of them decided to take their own lives and die by their own hands, and 150 men, women and children perished up there in the old tower there. A terrible, terrible event, commemorated every year in York. You'll find daffodils around the base of the tower, shaped like the Star of David. They're yellow and have 6 petals. But that isn't the end, of course, of the story. This tower, even though it wasn't the one that was there at the time, people noticed had red stains on the stones. And they believed in their guilty consciences this was the blood of the Jews massacred there. Now nowadays we know it's mostly iron oxide in the stone, but strangely, even though this is from the same quarry as the stone for York Minster and for the city walls, none of those have any red stains, just here. So there we go. Now people going inside have experienced strange things too, a strange feeling there, cold spots, and sometimes when they're taking photos a mist or orbs will appear. Richard Felix, famous paranormal historian, was doing a TV programme up here a few years back, and when they got back to the studio they found none of the footage recorded in there had turned out right. It was all distorted and had to film it again. And people do say a lot of electrical appliances and equipment doesn't function very well in there, so there may well be something going on there, something supernatural. Now, as terrible as that massacre was, it was certainly not the only instance of people being killed there. It's named Clifford's Tower because of the de Clifford family. Roger de Clifford was a bit of a black sheep of the family. He led a rebellion against Edward II and died at the Battle of Boroughbridge, because if you're going to try and kill the king, you got to get it right the first time. You don't really get given another chance. But he was hung in chains from the walls of the tower there that bore his family name, and left there till he basically fell apart. Left as an early form of bird feeder, you might say. Ironically, a few hundred years later, one of his distant descendants, a man known as Robert Aske, faced pretty much the same fate. Henry VIII had closed down all the abbeys in England. This didn't go down very well with a lot of people for religious reasons, and so he led a pilgrimage, the Pilgrimage of Grace, which led to a lot of upset. Henry was quite worried. Thousands of people all up in arms, demanding he stop what he was doing. What's that say? Patricia. Ah, yes. More of that in a moment. So Robert Aske, well, he led this Pilgrimage of Grace. He was a lawyer, but don't hold that against him. And he came down as far as Doncaster before Henry VIII decided he was going to have to do something about this. So he sent an emissary, and they said to the people, look, if you stand down, go home, nothing bad will happen to you. You'll be fine, and I'll stop what I'm doing. Sadly, Robert Aske believed him. As soon as this army of people had disbanded, Henry VIII went back on his word. He had all the ringleaders arrested, and they were hung, drawn and quartered. Apart from Robert Aske pled for his life. He pled for mercy, mercy, mercy. And Henry VIII, in his own way, sort of complied. He said, okay, I won't have you hung, drawn and quartered. He had him hung in chains, covered in tar. up there. And a bit of historical irony probably. So he's an ancestor. And he was left there for a year and a day as a warning to what would happen to people if basically they decided to defy Henry. Well, you know, it kind of works, doesn't it? It would put you off. So yes, Robert Aske was hung there too. Beautiful building. Shame I can't get up there and give it a better look for you because of all the work that's going on at the moment. So that's just some of the executions, of course. Now, it wasn't just the people being executed who got some kind of fame too. Sometimes the executioner themselves got a bit of notoriety there. There was a man called William Curry, or Mutton Curry to his friends. He wasn't originally an executioner, he was actually a sheep stealer, which is what he was arrested for, and himself was going to be sent abroad to Australia. This was the penalty for him, but his sentence was commuted because he volunteered when a position became available to become York's hangman. Now you might think that's a bit odd, but basically all the executioners were criminals. Nobody really wanted the job, including William, but he took it anyway, even though he was still a convicted criminal. And so William Curry became, for many years, the executioner here in York, hanging people. He hung Mary Bateman, in fact. But what made him famous, really, was he liked to drink, basically. He liked the sauce. And you can't blame him. I mean, it's not a very pleasant job. You've got to find your enjoyment where you can. So anyway, he would often turn up a little bit unsteadily to try and carry out his executioner's duties. On one occasion, he was hanging 5 men at once. And when they all fell down, he fell down with them, much to the hilarity of the crowd, who likes a bit of entertainment, you know. You come there for hanging, get a bit of comedy there as well. Who knows, you know. But the worst case, a man known as William Brown, well, at this point, you know, William Curry really was not at his best. He was stumbling up the steps, muttering and shouting at the crowd, going, "Oh, come on then, if you can do a better job, go on, you try." Ugh. It took him 5 attempts to get the noose around Brown's neck, and each time he tried, he knocked the bag off his head, leaving poor William Brown there floundering, staring out at this baying mob, all baying for his life, much to his annoyance, of course, and fear. And eventually, of course, he was hung and left to dance the hangman's jig, as they say. Now, hanging in films is kind of sanitised, you know, it's pretty quick, you know, the drop down, and that's it really. That's pretty much all you see. Maybe a couple of boots jerking around, but you can actually be up there for quite a long time. Anything from 15 minutes, sometimes nearly half an hour, depending how much you weigh. And you could be down up there for a while, and you know, gurgling, strangling your neck. With the old method of hanging, you know, it wasn't broken, you were left to strangle to death. So you're slowly turning a nice shade of purple, your tongue sticking out, and of course, as you die, well, unfortunately, your body evacuates everything, which is not the most dignified thing, but you've got more important things on your mind at the time, I suppose. But yes, so it's not very pleasant. But yes, William Curry went down in history, even immortalised in song and story down the various ale houses of York, where he liked to frequent. Sadly, he died a broken man, penniless and unhappy, but given his profession, you know, perhaps we shouldn't have too much sympathy for him. Now, of course, many famous people in York have met their end. The next person we're going to talk about, you've probably all heard of in some form or another. His name, well, is Dick Turpin, Richard Turpin, or John Palmer, depending on which who was asking at the time. So that was his alias. He wasn't from York, of course. He was an Essex boy. Bit of a geezer, you know what I mean. Started out as a butcher's apprentice. But, you know, that wasn't perhaps his favoured career. Didn't offer the kind of excitement and enjoyment that perhaps, you know, he longed for. He became a poacher, joined up with a gang, the Essex gang, led by a man called Samuel Gregory. And they began stealing deer and other animals. And then they began burgling houses, ransacking and threatening people. And Dick found he had a real calling for violence. He liked a bit of violence, did Dick. On one occasion, an old man refused to tell people where the money was. Not a problem for Dick. Oh no. He held him over a fire until eventually he revealed where the money was. So Dick didn't really have any problem with that. Of course, he's been romanticised a lot since then. If you're of a certain vintage like myself, the first time you heard of highwaymen was probably a song by Adam Ant about a dandy highwayman. But as you can tell, this didn't really apply to Dick. His image is being glossed over a bit by people, romanticised by the Victorians and many others. But after he was executed at York's Tyburn, up at the racecourse, 7th of April 1739, ironically by another former hangman, a man called Thomas Hadfield, who had turned, like William Curry, become a hangman to save his own neck, he was brought to this next building you see here, the Blue Boar Inn. He was brought here and laid out in the basements. Underneath it was nice and cold, of course, keep the body fresh. But people would actually pay money to come and see Dick. I mean, to see Dick Turpin, not anything else you might be thinking of. Clean your minds out there. But yes, they came to see Dick Turpin down there in the basements of the Blue Boar Inn, paying a penny a time to go down there. Now obviously, if it was modern days, they'd be having the cameras out doing a selfie with old Dick there, you know. But they didn't have that back then. Some people contented themselves with a lock of his hair. Some ladies, though, even gave his cold dead body a kiss. Each to their own, you know. I'm not judging, whatever you want to do. We're all adults here, but yes, Dick was down there until eventually he was buried. But being such a famous character, well, that wasn't the end for Dick, of course. He had an eventful life and an eventful death. You'd expect no less. So after he'd been buried, along came the body snatchers, the resurrection men as they were called. They dug him up, sold him to a local surgeon, as you do. However, eventually he did find his rest, or what was left of him, in a grave not too far from here. So they say. Apparently the body was buried in quicklime to prevent anyone else from digging him up. So whatever was there has long since gone to mush. But yes, the penultimate resting place of Dick Turpin there. Now, of course, he's not the only famous person, of course, from York. We've had so many people here, nearly 2,000 years of history. I mean, you know, it's bound to happen, isn't it, really? We tend to build these things up. And whilst I can't show you where the execution of this next gentleman happened, well, there's a place just nearby which will tell people a lot about him. People like to come here to the York Dungeons down here. Careful crossing the road. So yes, the York Dungeons, been here since the 80s, scaring the bejesus out of visiting tourists and hopefully telling them a bit about history as well. Sadly, we can't go inside, of course. Now, unlike the Castle Museum, it never actually was a dungeon. It's a more modern building, as you can tell. But inside, of course, they'll tell you about all the gory, nasty bits of history, much as I do. And inside there, of course, there's an exhibition of torture instruments and an exhibition about Guy Fawkes, who was, of course, born in York, as you may well know, in the year 1570. Now, torture and execution tend to go hand in hand, you know, one follows the other. And talking of hands, one of the many instruments that you might see if you go inside the dungeons are the thumb screws. Can't show you both thumbs, I'm holding a camera, but anyway, you know what a thumb looks like. The thumb screws, it was basically a vice-like contraption. You put your thumbs in there and slowly tighten it, cutting off the circulation, causing immense pain and so on. But it was a handy, pun intended, device, because you could still answer questions, you know, you weren't that incapacitated, and it's only your thumbs at the end of the day, you can still sign a confession. So this was used quite a lot as a torture device. Not the only one, of course. They also had the rack. Now, we don't know the exact details of what happened to Guy. We do know, of course, there was another bus going by. It's a very busy lockdown, isn't it? Anyway, Guy, when he was found underneath the Houses of Parliament in November 1605, we know he tried to get his way out of it. He protested his innocence. He said, "I'm just a humble servant. My name is John. Yes, that's it. My name's John. Surname? Johnson. Yeah, John Johnson, that's me. I'm absolutely not here to blow up the... I'm not doing anything to do with the king at all. This is just some firewood, and these barrels don't have gunpowder in, honestly." But, well, you know. Well, he didn't get away with it. They were a bit less gullible than some people there, and he was eventually taken away and subjected to several days of torture. They may well have used the thumb screws, but we know he was on the rack, stretched out on a wooden frame, his arms and legs tied up, and they'd twist the wheel, slowly stretching him out. Up to a point, it might be slightly therapeutic if you've got a bad back, but after a few turns, any therapeutic benefits would, I'm sure, be lost. And arms and legs were dislocated and immense pain caused. He did manage to hold out for a few days before eventually he gave in and confessed, by which time his accomplices had all been rounded up anyway. So there wasn't much point in holding out any longer anyway. Then he was subjected to a very brutal form of execution I mentioned earlier on, being hung, drawn and quartered. Now, what this basically entails is you're dragged behind a horse on the streets, which are not very clean, of course, and then you're taken to the gallows to be hung, but not to death. You're hung until you go a shade of purple and pass out, and then they cut you down, wake you up a bit, wakey, and then the next thing you know, some guy is sticking a knife into your stomach and opening you up for all to see, all your inside bits and bobs, which you probably wanted to keep intact inside, you know, as you probably do. But anyway, that happens, and then they reach inside you whilst you're still alive, and they bring out the bits and they show them in front of your face. Now, at this point, if you've seen the film Braveheart, the filmmakers would have you believe you can still shout "Freedom!" But I think you've got more pressing matters on your mind in that kind of situation, to be honest, rather than shouting. But that's Mel Gibson for you. But they'd also take out a knife and cut off your bits and burn those as well in front of your face if you were still alive and well enough to actually care. However, Guy, luckily for him, if he can be lucky in this situation, didn't have to endure all of this torment, because so badly injured had he been by his torture and his incarceration as he made his way up the steps to the gallows, he fell and broke his neck. Of course, they still had a lot of people there wanting to see the execution, and of course, well, you know, you can't disappoint the crowds, can you? So basically they carried on with his dead body, hung, drawing and quartering him for all to enjoy. Now the head was placed on a spike on Tower Bridge, but what they did after that, they chopped off the arms and legs and they sent them to different parts of the country, just so everyone definitely knew, back in the days before social media, that he was really dead. And York, I think, got a leg or an arm, I'm not sure. But anyway, he never came back to the city of his birth intact, shall we say. Now, things have changed a bit since I used to work in this establishment here, but they used to have an execution show with a replica of a Yorkshire invention. Aye, Yorkshire. Aye, we're quite inventive when we get our minds to it. And what we did, we invented a device in Halifax called the Halifax gibbet. Now this is actually a precursor of a guillotine, but we got there a few hundred years before the French, so we were ahead on that one. Yes, sorry. The jokes don't get any better, I'm afraid. But anyway, yes, we were ahead on that when we created this device, the Halifax gibbet. Now, unlike the guillotine or guillotine, it had instead of a long straight blade which would neatly get rid of your head, this one just had an old axe blade, and it wasn't very sharp apparently. It relied more upon the weight and the brute force to come down and basically rip your head off rather than a nice clean cut. But nevertheless, it was perhaps a bit more, I don't know, fair and democratic perhaps than just having some guy with an axe trying to knock your block off, because certain executioners weren't so good at their job, and it could take 2 or even 3 blows of the axe to sever the neck completely. So at least this one took it off in one go, which is probably about the only saving grace of it, really. There's actually still a replica in Halifax if you do go down there, near the Market Square. So anyway, this device, this inventive means of execution, you know, got the job done, perhaps not in the best way. But of course, it's not the only means of chopping your block off. I mean, and that was generally reserved for the rich. So what you could do if you wanted to make a bit of money, if you were a volunteer, you know, axeman there, well, basically, to ensure that they got a quick send-off, people would actually pay their executioner. I mean, you can't take it with you, can you? You know, to be honest. So you would hand over a few gold coins to the axeman to, you know, just get it done as neatly and quick as possible. Don't, you know, hack away. You know, you want to at least have some final dignity. Now we're going to be leaving the dungeons in a short while, but inside here, well, they also have a few ghosts, so I might as well mention those. I can speak from some personal experience that there is definitely something going on there. So even after all the tourists and staff have gone home, it's still a bit of a spooky place to be. It was built on top of an old friary, and some of the monks have still been seen walking through down on the lower levels of the dungeons here. Also, one of the old caretakers is known to still be doing his rounds. People have heard the keys jangling and seen a figure there. A man working inside there on a stepladder felt somebody grab hold of him, and he almost fell off the stepladder whilst he was in there. There's also a young child. Now this is the ghost I've had a bit of an encounter with. Down by where the maze is, or was certainly, I think it's still there, the mirror maze, is where they tend to see the figure of a small child. And you do get children in the dungeons, of course, when it's open. So, you know, perhaps in those occasions people haven't noticed. But when you're down there in the dark, waiting for the next tour group to arrive, it does get a bit weird. There's a strange feeling sometimes down there, as though perhaps you're being watched. And I know people working there who have actually seen a figure of a small child, and of course have gone to see if the child's maybe got separated from the rest of the group, but they're not there. They've gone. Yes. But that one definitely